The rope burns into Clara Whitmore's wrists as Silas Crow drags her through the dirt street of Red Mesa like livestock headed for slaughter. 24 years old, and this is how her story ends. Not with dignity, not with choice, but with dust in her mouth and the entire town watching through windows like cowards. Crow's voice cuts through the afternoon heat. This one's headed to Madam Lacey's place in Tucson, unless someone here wants to settle her daddy's debt right now. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. The silence is worse than the rope. Clara stops fighting and closes her eyes, waiting for whatever comes next, until she hears the horse. One set of hooves, steady, unhurried. When she looks up, a man she's never seen before is climbing down from a gray stallion, and he's staring at Crow like he's looking at something that needs killing. "How much does she owe?" the stranger asks. Crow grins. "More than you got, Drifter." The man pulls a roll of bills from his coat, counts it out slow, then throws it in the dirt at Crow's feet. "That cover it?" Crow's grin dies. The stranger walks over, cuts the rope from Clara's wrist with a knife that's seen too much use, and says quiet enough that only she can hear, "You don't belong to nobody. Not him, not me, not nobody." Then he turns to the crowd and says louder, "Anybody got a problem with that?" The town stays silent. Clara's legs shake, but she doesn't fall. She's still standing when the stranger walks back to his horse, and she's still standing when Crow's face twists into something murderous. This is the moment everything changes. This is where the war begins. If you want to see how far this story reaches, if you want to know whether Clara survives what's coming next, drop a comment with the name of the city you're watching from. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. Clara's father had died 3 days before Silas Crow came to collect. She'd buried him herself in the small plot behind the house, the same plot where her mother had been laid 6 years earlier. No preacher, no ceremony, just Clara and a shovel and the relentless Arizona sun beating down on her back until her dress stuck to her skin and her hands bled through the blisters. She didn't cry. There wasn't time for crying. There was only the work, the same work there had always been, feeding the chickens, hauling water from the well, trying to keep the farm from collapsing into the dust that seemed determined to swallow everything in Red Mesa. Her father had been a good man once, a kind man, but kindness didn't pay debts, and debts in Red Mesa belonged to Silas Crow. She should have seen it coming, should have known that a man like Crow didn't lend money out of generosity. He lent it because he liked owning people, liked watching them squirm when the payments came due and they had nothing left to give. Her father had borrowed to keep the farm going after a bad drought 2 summers back. Then he'd borrowed again to cover the first loan. Then again. And again. Until the farm wasn't theirs anymore. It was Crow's. They'd just been living on it, pretending otherwise. When her father finally died, his heart giving out in the middle of the night, quiet and without warning, Clara had felt something close to relief. Not because she didn't love him, but because at least he wouldn't have to see what came next. Crow showed up on the 3rd day with 2 men Clara didn't recognize. Big men, the kind who got paid to stand behind someone and look like violence waiting to happen. Crow himself was tall and thin, his face all sharp angles and cold eyes, like something carved out of stone and left to dry in the desert. He wore a black suit that didn't belong in a place like Red Mesa, too clean, too expensive. It made him look like a preacher, except preachers didn't smile the way Crow smiled. "Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat like they were meeting at a church social. "I'm sorry for your loss." Clara stood in the doorway of the house, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. "What do you want, Mr. Crow?" "Just came to discuss the matter of your father's debt." "There's nothing to discuss. The farm's yours. You know that." "Well, that's true." Crow's smile didn't move. "But the farm don't cover what's owed, not by half." Clara's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Crow pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket, unfolded it slow, like he was enjoying the moment. "Your father signed for $600 over the last 2 years. The farm's worth maybe $250 if I'm being generous. That leaves $350 outstanding." "That's not possible. He wouldn't." "He did." Crow held up the paper. "His signature's right here, witnessed and notarized." Clara stared at the paper, but the words blurred together. $350. It might as well have been $3,000. She didn't have 50 cents to her name. I don't have it, she said quietly. I know. Crow folded the paper back up, tucked it into his coat. But I got a solution. That was when Clara felt the first real spike of fear. I got business associates in Tucson, Crow continued. They run a place called the Silver Rose. Nice establishment, clean. They're always looking for girls, and they pay fair for the right kind. The words hit her like a fist. You want to sell me? I want to settle a debt. Crow's smile finally faded. You got another way to pay $350. I'm listening. Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Go to hell. Crow's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something mean. That's unfortunate, Miss Whitmore. Real unfortunate. He nodded to the two men behind him, and before Clara could move, they were on her. One grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her back. The other looped a rope around her wrists, pulling it tight enough to bite into her skin. She kicked, twisted, tried to scream, but the man holding her clamped a hand over her mouth. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Crow said calmly. You fight, you get hurt, you cooperate, maybe you end up somewhere decent. Clara bit down on the hand covering her mouth. The man yelped and jerked back, and she managed to suck in a breath before he hit her hard across the face. Her vision went white for a second, then red, then steadied into a dull throb that pulsed behind her eyes. Enough, Crow snapped. I need her in one piece. They dragged her out of the house, down the porch steps, into the street. Clara's boots scraped against the dirt as she fought to stay upright, but it didn't matter. Crow had one end of the rope now, pulling her along like a dog on a leash. People were starting to come out of the buildings, shopkeepers, farmers, the blacksmith, the women who ran the boarding house. They stood in doorways and on porches, watching. Not one of them said a word. Anybody want to buy out this debt? Crow called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear. $350 and the girl's free to go. Silence. Crow waited, letting the moment stretch. Clara could feel every pair of eyes on her, could feel the weight of their pity and their fear. She wanted to scream at them, to beg them for help, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Crow owned this town the same way he'd owned her father. Nobody was going to stand up to him. No takers? Crow shook his head, mock sad. Well, that's a shame. Guess she's headed to Tucson after all. Clara's knees buckled, and she hit the dirt hard. The rope yanked her forward, dragging her a few feet before Crow stopped. She could taste blood in her mouth. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She didn't have the strength to stand again. This was it. This was how her life ended. And then she heard the horse. It wasn't the sound of a horse in a hurry. It was steady, deliberate, like whoever was riding didn't care about the scene they were walking into. Clara lifted her head, squinting through the dust and the haze of pain, and saw him. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty coat and a hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. He rode a gray stallion that looked like it had seen 1,000 miles and wasn't impressed by any of them. He dismounted slow, like he had all the time in the world, and when he looked at Crow, his expression was flat, dead calm. How much does she owe? The stranger asked. His voice was low, rough, like gravel underfoot. Crow's smile came back. More than you got, Drifter. The stranger reached into his coat, pulled out a roll of bills, and counted them out one by one. Then he tossed the whole roll into the dirt at Crow's feet. That cover it? Crow stared at the money, and for the first time Clara saw something flicker in his face. Surprise. Maybe anger. He bent down, picked up the bills, counted them. That's $350, Crow said slowly. Then we're done here. The stranger walked over to Clara, pulled a knife from his belt, and cut the rope. Clara's hands fell free, and she rubbed at her wrists where the rope had burned the skin raw. The stranger didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment, then turned back to Crow. She don't belong to you anymore, the stranger said. She don't belong to me either. She don't belong to nobody. You got a problem with that? Crow's jaw tightened. You just made a real bad mistake, friend. Wouldn't be the first time. The stranger walked back to his horse, climbed into the saddle, and looked down at Clara. You got somewhere to go. Clara stared at him. Her brain wasn't working right. Nothing made sense. No, I don't. Then you better come with me. I don't even know you. Name's Colt Mercer. I run a ranch about 3 days north of here. I need help moving horses across the frontier. You want the job? It's yours. Clara looked around at the town. At the people still standing in doorways, still silent, still useless. At Crow, who was watching her like a hawk watches a rabbit. At the house behind her, the house that wasn't hers anymore. "What if I say no?" she asked. Colt Mercer's expression didn't change. "Then I ride off, and you figure it out on your own." Clara looked at Crow one more time. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't done with her. She could see it in the way he stood, in the way his hand rested on the gun at his hip. "I'll take the job," she said. Colt nodded. "Get on." Clara climbed up behind him, her hands gripping the back of the saddle. Colt clicked his tongue, and the horse started moving. They rode out of Red Mesa slow, steady, like they had nothing to prove. Clara didn't look back. She didn't want to see the town she was leaving behind. She didn't want to see Crow's face. But she could feel him watching. She could feel the weight of his hatred following her like a shadow. And she knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Wait. They rode in silence for the first hour. Claire's hands ached from gripping the saddle, and her face throbbed where the man had hit her. Every step the horse took sent a jolt through her ribs, and she was pretty sure she'd cracked something when she hit the dirt. But she didn't complain. She didn't say a word. She just held on and tried not to fall off. Colt didn't look back at her. Didn't ask if she was okay. He just rode, his posture easy, like he'd been in the saddle his whole life. Clara studied the back of his head, the line of his shoulders, the way he held the reins. He didn't look like a man who made stupid decisions. He looked like a man who knew exactly what he was doing, which made what he'd just done all the more confusing. "Why'd you do it?" Clara finally asked. Colt didn't answer right away. He was quiet for so long that Clara thought maybe he hadn't heard her. Then, without turning around, he said, "Do what?" "Pay my debt. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Didn't do it for you." Clara frowned. "Then why?" "Did it because Crow needed to see that somebody wasn't afraid of him." "And you're not?" Colt was quiet again. Then, "I've seen worse than Silas Crow." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They kept riding. The sun dropped lower in the sky, turning the desert orange and red, and the heat started to fade into something cooler, almost pleasant. Clara's grip on the saddle loosened a little. Her breathing evened out. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Tonight? Nowhere. We'll camp once it gets dark." "And tomorrow?" "North, toward the canyon country. I got a contract to move 30 horses to a military post near the Colorado line. After that, we head to my ranch." "You really need help with the horses?" "I really do." Clara didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. She was too tired to argue, too tired to think. All she wanted was to lie down and close her eyes and pretend, just for a few hours, that the last 3 days hadn't happened. They made camp an hour after sunset in a shallow basin surrounded by scrub brush and rocks. Colt unsaddled the horse, set up a small fire, and pulled a bedroll from his pack. He handed Clara a canteen and a piece of dried meat that tasted like leather. "Eat," he said. "You look like you're about to fall over." Clara ate because she didn't have the energy to refuse. The meat was tough, but it was food, and she hadn't eaten since the morning. She drank from the canteen, then handed it back. Colt took a swig, then set it down between them. "You got family anywhere?" he asked. "No." "Friends?" "Not anymore." Colt nodded, like he'd expected that answer. "You ever work with horses?" "Some. My father had 2. I know how to feed them, brush them. I've ridden a little." "That'll do." Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them. The fire crackled in the silence. She could hear the wind moving through the brush, the distant call of a coyote. It was peaceful in a way that felt wrong. She should have been terrified. She should have been crying, falling apart. Instead, she just felt numb. "What happens if Crow comes after us?" she asked quietly. Colt poked at the fire with a stick. "He won't." "How do you know?" "Because coming after us means riding 3 days into open country where he's got no control and no backup. Crow's a bully, but he's not stupid. He'll let it go." Clara wanted to believe that. She really did. But she'd seen the look in Crow's eyes when Colt had tossed that money at his feet. That wasn't the look of a man who let things go. "You don't know him," she said. Colt looked at her for the first time since they'd stopped. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "No." But I know men like him. And what kind of men are those? The kind who think power makes them untouchable. Colt's jaw tightened. They're wrong. Clara didn't push it. She lay down on the ground, using her arm as a pillow, and stared up at the stars. There were so many of them out here, away from the town lights. They stretched across the sky like somebody had spilled a bag of diamonds and didn't bother picking them up. Thank you, she said quietly. Colt didn't answer, but she thought she saw him nod in the firelight. She closed her eyes and fell asleep before the fire burned out. PM. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Colt saddling the horse. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her face was swollen where she'd been hit, and her wrists were raw and blistered. She sat up slowly, groaning. Colt handed her a tin cup of coffee without a word. Clara took it, grateful, and sipped. It was strong and bitter and exactly what she needed. We got a long ride today, Colt said. You up for it? Clara nodded, even though she wasn't sure she was. I'll manage. Good. We'll reach the first waypoint by nightfall if we don't run into trouble. What kind of trouble? Colt glanced at her. The kind that likes to rob travelers. Clara's stomach tightened. You think we'll run into anyone? Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, you stay close and do what I say. I'm not a child. Didn't say you were. But out here, hesitation gets you killed. Clara didn't argue. She drank the rest of her coffee, handed the cup back, and climbed onto the horse behind Colt. They rode out as the sun started to climb, the desert stretching out in every direction like an ocean of dust and stone. The day passed slowly. The heat was brutal, and Clara's skin burned despite the wide-brimmed hat Colt had given her. They stopped twice to water the horse and rest in whatever shade they could find, but it was never enough. By the time the sun started to drop again, Clara felt like she'd been wrung out and left to dry. How much farther? She asked, her voice hoarse. Another hour. Clara groaned. Colt almost smiled. Almost. You're tougher than you look, he said. I don't feel tough. Tough ain't about feeling, it's about doing. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They reached the waypoint just as the last light drained from the sky. It wasn't much, a dry creek bed surrounded by rocks and a few scraggly trees, but it was sheltered, and there was enough brush to build a fire. Colt unsaddled the horse again, set up camp, and handed Clara another piece of dried meat. Same menu as last night, he said. You got anything else? Nope. Clara sighed and ate. It tasted worse the second time, but she was too hungry to care. How long have you been ranching? She asked after a while. 5 years. You do it alone? Mostly. Why? Colt looked at her, and for a second Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, Because I'm better at being alone. Clara didn't know what to make of that, but she didn't push. She could see in the way he moved, the way he spoke, that Colt Mercer was a man who kept his walls high and his doors locked. She wasn't going to pry them open in one night. You got a first name? She asked instead. Colt? No, I mean, Colt what? Mercer's your last name, right? Yeah. So what's your first name? Colt stared at her like she'd just asked the stupidest question in the world. Colt is my first name. Clara blinked. Oh. What'd you think it was? Short for something? I don't know. Colton, maybe? It's Colt. Just Colt. Okay, sorry. Colt shook his head and went back to poking the fire. Clara bit back a smile. It was the first time she'd felt even remotely like herself since her father died. What about you? Colt asked after a minute. Clara what? Whitmore. Your folks from Red Mesa? My father was. My mother came from back east, Pennsylvania. Long way from home. Yeah, Clara's smile faded. She hated it here. The heat, the dust, the loneliness. She used to say the desert was trying to kill her. Was she right? Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Clara felt the exhaustion pulling at her again, heavier this time. She lay down on the ground, pulled her coat over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Colt? She said quietly. Yeah? Why do you think Crow wanted me so bad? I mean, $350 is a lot of money for a debt. He could have just taken the farm and called it even. Colt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Because men like Crow don't care about money. They care about control. You walking away makes him look weak. That's worse than losing $300. Clara opened her eyes and stared at the stars again. So he's going to come after us? Maybe. And if he does? Colt didn't answer, but Clara could feel the weight of the silence. It said everything he wasn't saying out loud. She closed her eyes again and tried not to think about it. The next day started the same as the one before. Coffee, dried meat, endless writing. But this time, Clara noticed the way Colt kept scanning the horizon, the way his hand stayed close to the rifle strapped to his saddle. He was expecting trouble. You see something? Clara asked. Not yet. But you think you will? Maybe. Clara tightened her grip on the saddle. What do I do if someone comes after us? You stay on the horse and you don't get off unless I tell you to. What if... Clara, Colt's voice was sharp. You stay on the horse. That's the only rule. Clara swallowed and nodded. Okay. They rode for another hour before Colt pulled the horse to a stop. Clara's heart jumped into her throat. What is it? She whispered. Riders, 3 of them, coming from the east. Clara twisted around, trying to see, but the desert was flat and empty in every direction. How do you know? Dust cloud. Clara squinted and finally saw it, a faint plume of dust rising in the distance, small but growing. Her stomach dropped. Is it Crow? Don't know yet, but we're not sticking around to find out. Colt clicked his tongue, and the horse broke into a gallop. Clara held on tight, her heart pounding. The wind whipped past her face, and the desert blurred into streaks of brown and red. She risked a glance back and saw the dust cloud getting closer. They're gaining, she shouted. I know! Colt pushed the horse harder, but Clara could feel the animal starting to tire. They'd been riding all morning, and the heat was brutal. The horse couldn't keep this pace much longer. Colt! I know! Up ahead, Clara saw a ridge of rocks jutting out of the ground. Colt steered toward it, and when they reached it, he pulled the horse to a stop and jumped down. Get off, he said. Clara slid off the horse, her legs shaking. Colt grabbed the rifle from the saddle and pulled Clara behind the rocks. He handed her the reins. Hold on to him. Don't let him spook. Clara nodded, her hands trembling. Colt crouched behind the rocks, rifle ready, and waited. The riders came into view a minute later. 3 men on horseback, moving fast. Clara's breath caught when she saw the one in front. That's one of Crow's men, she whispered. The one who tied me up. Colt didn't say anything. He just raised the rifle and sighted down the barrel. The riders slowed as they approached the ridge, clearly unsure if Colt was armed. The man in front, the one Clara recognized, called out, We just want the girl. Send her out, and we'll leave you alone. Colt fired a shot into the dirt 5 feet in front of the lead horse. The animal reared, and the man cursed, fighting to keep control. Next one's not a warning, Colt shouted. The man steadied his horse and glared. You're making a mistake, friend. I've made plenty. One more won't kill me. The 3 men sat there for a long moment weighing their options. Then the lead man spat into the dirt and turned his horse around. Crow's going to hear about this, he shouted. He's going to come for you. Let him, Colt shouted back. The riders disappeared over the horizon, and Clara finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the ground. Colt lowered the rifle and turned to her. You okay? No, Clara said honestly. I'm not. Colt crouched down beside her. You did good. You didn't panic. I wanted to. But you didn't. That's what matters. Clara looked at him, at the calm in his eyes, and she felt something shift inside her. This man, this stranger, had put his life on the line for her. Twice now. And she didn't even know why. Why are you doing this? She asked. Colt stood up, slung the rifle over his shoulder. Because somebody's gotta. He didn't say anything else. He just climbed back onto the horse and waited for Clara to follow. She did. And as they rode away from the ridge, Clara realized that Colt Mercer was either the bravest man she'd ever met or the most reckless. Maybe both. They rode hard for the rest of the day, only stopping when the horse couldn't go any farther. By the time they made camp that night, Clara was so exhausted she could barely stand. Colt set up the fire in silence, and Clara collapsed onto the ground without bothering to eat. Clara, Colt's voice cut through the fog in her head. She opened her eyes. He was holding out a canteen. Drink. She took it and drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it helped. You need to eat something, Colt said. I'm not hungry. Don't care. Eat anyway. He handed her the dried meat, and Clara forced herself to chew and swallow. It tasted like dust. How long until we get to the ranch? She asked. If we don't run into more trouble? 3 days. 3 days. Clara didn't know if she could make it 3 more days. What happens if Crow's men catch up to us before then? She asked. Colt looked at her, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his expression. Something that looked almost like regret. Then I deal with it, he said. By yourself? I've done it before. Clara wanted to ask what he meant by that, but she was too tired. She lay down and closed her eyes, and this time sleep came fast and heavy. When she woke, the fire was out, and Colt was already saddling the horse. Time to move, he said. Clara groaned but got to her feet. Her body screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She climbed onto the horse behind Colt, and they rode into the rising sun. The day passed in a blur of heat and dust and silence. Clara drifted in and out of awareness, her head resting against Colt's back. She didn't realize she'd fallen asleep until Colt shook her awake. Clara, wake up. She opened her eyes and blinked. They were stopped at the edge of a canyon. The sun was setting, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold. We're here, Colt said. Clara looked around, confused. Here where? The waypoint. We meet the horse herd tomorrow morning. Clara slid off the horse and looked around. There was a small stream running through the canyon, the first water she'd seen in days. She walked over to it, knelt down, and splashed her face. The water was cold and clear, and it felt like heaven. Don't drink too much, Colt warned. You'll make yourself sick. Clara nodded and stood up. Colt was setting up camp again, his movements efficient, practiced. Clara watched him for a minute, then walked over. Can I help? She asked. You know how to build a fire? Yeah. Then go ahead. Clara gathered brush and kindling, stacked it, and struck a match. The fire caught on the first try, and Clara felt a flicker of pride. Colt glanced over, nodded once, and went back to unpacking the saddle. They ate in silence again, but this time it felt different. Less tense, almost comfortable. Tomorrow morning we pick up the horses, Colt said. 30 of them. Wild caught, barely broke. They're going to be mean and stubborn, and half of them will try to run the first chance they get. Sounds fun, Clara said dryly. Colt almost smiled. It's not, but it pays. How long will it take to move them? Week? Maybe 2? Depends on how much trouble they give us. Clara nodded. And after that? After that, we head to the ranch. You can stay as long as you want, work if you want, leave if you don't. You just let me go? I ain't keeping you prisoner, Clara. You're free to do whatever you want. Clara looked at him, at the steady way he met her eyes, and she believed him. Colt Mercer might be rough and quiet and hard to read, but he wasn't a liar. I'll stay, she said. Colt nodded. Good. They sat there in the firelight, the canyon walls rising around them like sentinels. Clara felt the exhaustion pulling at her again, but she didn't fight it this time. She lay down and closed her eyes, and for the first time in days she felt something almost like peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight she was safe. And that was enough. The horses arrived at dawn, and they were everything Colt had promised, mean, stubborn, and wild as the desert wind. Clara woke to the sound of hooves thundering across the canyon floor and sat up so fast she nearly cracked her head on a rock. Colt was already on his feet, rifle in hand, watching as a group of 6 riders herded 30 horses toward their camp. The animals moved like a single organism, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring, kicking up enough dust to choke on. Stay back, Colt said without looking at her. Clara scrambled to her feet and pressed herself against the canyon wall as the horses swept past. They were beautiful in a raw, untamed way. Bays and chestnuts and grays, their coats slick with sweat, their muscles bunching and releasing with every stride. She'd never seen so many horses in one place, and the sheer force of them moving together made her chest feel tight. The lead rider pulled up near Colt, a grizzled man with a gray beard and a face like worn leather. He climbed down from his horse and spat into the dirt. Mercer, he said by way of greeting. Walsh? Got your horses. Meanest batch I've caught in 5 years. Half of them tried to kill my boys on the way here. Colt walked toward the herd, studying them with the kind of focus Clara had only seen him use when scanning for danger. They look sound. Sound enough? You got your work cut out for you getting them to the post, though. I've handled worse, Walsh snorted. Sure you have. His eyes flicked to Clara, who was still pressed against the canyon wall like she was trying to become part of it. Who's the girl? She's helping me move the herd. Walsh's eyebrows shot up. Her? She don't look like she could handle a donkey, let alone 30 half-broke horses. She'll manage. Walsh looked at Clara again, longer this time, and Clara felt her face heat. She straightened up, forcing herself to step away from the wall. She didn't know the first thing about herding wild horses, but she wasn't about to let some stranger see her scared. I'll manage, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Walsh grinned. Well, all right then. Good luck to you both. You're going to need it. He climbed back onto his horse and tipped his hat. Money's due when you deliver. Don't lose more than 3, or the price drops. I know the deal, Colt said. Walsh and his men rode off, leaving Clara and Colt alone with 30 horses that looked ready to bolt at the first sign of weakness. Clara stared at the herd, her stomach nodding. Colt? She said quietly. Yeah? I don't know what I'm doing. Colt finally looked at her, and for the first time she saw something that might have been amusement in his eyes. You'll learn. Come on. He walked toward the herd, and Clara followed because she didn't know what else to do. The horses shifted and stamped, their ears flicking back and forth. One of them, a big chestnut with a white blaze, bared its teeth and lunged at Colt. He sidestepped without flinching, his hand coming up to smack the horse's shoulder hard enough to make it back off. Don't let them think you're afraid, Colt said. They can smell fear. You show weakness, they'll run right over you. Clara swallowed. Great. You see that bay mare over there, the one with the crooked ear? Clara scanned the herd until she found her. A smaller horse, standing slightly apart from the others, her head low. Yeah. She's the leader, the rest of them follow her. You control her, you control the herd. And how do I control her? You don't. I do. You just keep the stragglers from breaking off. Clara nodded, even though she had no idea how she was supposed to do that. Colt moved through the herd like he belonged there, his movements calm and deliberate. The horses watched him, but didn't bolt. After a few minutes, he managed to get a rope around the bay mare's neck. She fought him for a second, rearing up, but Colt held firm, talking to her in a low voice Clara couldn't quite hear. Slowly, the mare settled. All right, Colt called out. We're moving. Stay on the left flank and keep your eyes open. Any horse breaks off, you yell. Yell what? Doesn't matter. Just yell. Clara climbed onto Colt's gray stallion, which he'd saddled while she wasn't paying attention, and took up position on the left side of the herd. Colt mounted a different horse, a rangy roan that looked like it had seen better days, and started moving the bay mare forward. The rest of the herd followed, reluctant but obedient. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The horses moved in a loose cluster, the bay mare leading the way, and Clara's only job was to ride alongside and make sure none of them wandered off. It was exhausting in a different way than the last few days had been. Her legs ached from gripping the saddle, her eyes burned from the dust, and her shoulders tensed every time one of the horses so much as twitched in her direction. But she didn't fall off, and she didn't lose any horses, and by the time Colt called for a break, she felt almost competent. Not bad, Colt said when they stopped near a dry creek bed. I didn't do anything, Clara said. You stayed on the horse. That's more than most people manage their first day. Clara slid off the stallion and nearly collapsed. Her legs felt like jelly. Colt handed her the canteen and she drank, grateful. How long do we do this every day? She asked. Sunrise to sunset. We'll cover maybe 10-12 miles if we're lucky. Clara groaned. That's it? Horses can't move faster than that. Not for long, anyway. Push them too hard. They'll break down. Clara sat down in the dirt and pulled off her hat, wiping the sweat from her forehead. The sun was brutal, even this early in the day. She could already feel her skin burning. You got a long way to go before this gets easier, Colt said, watching her. Thanks for the encouragement. Just being honest. Clara looked at him, at the way he stood there like the heat and the exhaustion didn't touch him, and she felt a flicker of irritation. Do you ever get tired? Every day. You don't show it. Showing it don't help. Clara didn't have an answer for that, so she drank more water and tried to ignore the way her whole body ached. After a few minutes, Colt walked over to the herd, checking on the horses one by one. Clara watched him move, the way his hands ran over their legs and shoulders, checking for injuries or soreness. He was good with them. Patient. She hadn't expected that. "Where'd you learn to do this?" she called out. "Do what?" "Handle horses." Colt didn't answer right away. He finished checking the last horse, then walked back to where Clara was sitting. "My father ran a ranch when I was a kid. He taught me." "Is he still ranching?" "No, he's dead." Clara winced. "I'm sorry." Colt shrugged. It was a long time ago. He didn't offer anything else, and Clara didn't push. She was starting to learn that Colt didn't talk about his past unless he had to, and even then, he only gave the bare minimum. It was like pulling teeth, except the teeth were made of stone and didn't want to come out. They rested for another 10 minutes, then got back on the horses and kept moving. The day dragged on, hot and dusty and endless. Clara's back started to hurt, then her neck, then her arms. By mid-afternoon, she was pretty sure every part of her body was staging a mutiny. But she didn't complain. She just kept riding, kept watching the herd, kept doing what Colt told her to do. It wasn't until late afternoon that things went wrong. One of the younger horses, a skittish gray gelding, spooked at something Clara didn't see and bolted. He broke away from the herd so fast that Clara barely had time to register what was happening before he was 50 yards away and still running. "Clara, go!" Colt shouted. Clara kicked the stallion into a gallop, her heart hammering. The gray gelding was fast, and he had a head start. Clara leaned forward, urging the stallion faster, the wind whipping past her face. The ground blurred beneath her, and for a second she thought she wasn't going to catch him. Then the stallion surged forward, closing the gap, and Clara found herself alongside the gelding. "Easy," she shouted, reaching for his mane. "Easy." The gelding veered left, nearly slamming into her. Clara yanked the reins, trying to cut him off, but he was too fast. She could feel the stallion starting to tire, his breathing labored. If she didn't stop the gelding soon, she was going to lose him. She did the only thing she could think of. She leaned over, grabbed the gelding's mane with both hands, and pulled herself sideways until she was practically hanging off the side of the stallion. The gelding tried to veer again, but Clara held on, using her weight to force him to slow down. It worked. Sort of. The gelding stumbled, and Clara lost her grip. She hit the ground hard, rolled twice, and came up spitting dirt. The gelding stopped a few yards away, sides heaving, eyes wild. Clara pushed herself to her feet, every part of her body screaming. She walked toward the gelding slowly, her hands out. "Easy," she said again, her voice shaking. "It's okay. You're okay." The gelding watched her, nostrils flaring. Clara took another step, then another. When she was close enough, she reached out and grabbed his mane. He flinched but didn't bolt. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Colt rode up a minute later, the rest of the herd trailing behind him. He looked at Clara, then at the gelding, then back at Clara. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded, even though she wasn't sure. "Yeah, that was stupid. I got him, didn't I?" "You could have broken your neck." "But I didn't." Colt stared at her for a long moment, and Clara thought he was going to yell at her. Instead, he shook his head and almost smiled. "You're tougher than you look." "You keep saying that, because it keeps being true." Clara climbed back onto the stallion, every muscle protesting. The gelding followed, docile now, and they rejoined the herd. Clara's hands were shaking, and her heart was still racing, but she didn't let it show. She just kept riding. When they made camp that night, Clara could barely move. She slid off the horse and collapsed onto the ground, groaning. Colt set up the fire without comment, then handed her the canteen. "Drink," he said. Clara drank. The water was warm, but she didn't care. "You did good today," Colt said after a while. Clara looked at him, surprised. "Really? Really? Most people would have let that horse go." "I didn't want to cost you money." "It wasn't about the money." Clara frowned. "Then what was it about?" Colt poked at the fire with a stick. "You didn't give up. That matters." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. They ate in silence, the usual dried meat and stale bread that Colt had pulled from his pack. Clara was too tired to complain. She finished eating, lay down, and closed her eyes. Clara? Colt said. Yeah? You're going to be sore tomorrow. I'm sore now. It'll be worse. Clara groaned. Thanks. Colt didn't say anything else, but Clara thought she heard him chuckle. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire crackling and the horses shifting in the darkness. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. They woke at dawn, moved the herd until sunset, made camp, and collapsed. Clara's body adjusted slowly, the soreness fading into a dull ache that never quite went away. She learned to read the horses, to anticipate when one was about to bolt, to move with the herd instead of fighting it. Colt didn't say much, but he didn't need to. Clara could see the way he watched her, the way he nodded when she did something right. It was the closest thing to praise she'd gotten in years, and it felt good. On the 4th day, they reached the edge of the canyon country. The landscape shifted from flat desert to rolling hills and jagged rock formations that looked like they'd been carved by giants. The herd slowed, picking their way over loose stones and narrow trails. Clara's heart was in her throat the whole time, sure that one of the horses was going to slip and break a leg, but Colt moved them through with the same calm confidence he brought to everything else. They camped that night in a narrow canyon, the walls rising so high on either side that Clara couldn't see the sky. It felt like being at the bottom of a well, and it made her uneasy. You don't like it here, Colt said. It wasn't a question. It's too closed in, Clara admitted. We'll be out of it tomorrow. Promise? Colt nodded. Promise. Clara lay down and stared at the sliver of sky visible between the canyon walls. She could hear the horses moving, restless, and the sound of Colt checking the perimeter. She didn't fall asleep until she heard him settle by the fire. The next morning, they were moving before the sun came up. The canyon opened into a wide valley, and Clara felt the tension in her chest ease. The herd picked up speed, sensing the open space, and Clara had to work to keep them together. By midday, they were clear of the canyon country, and the landscape flattened out again. We're making good time, Colt said. If this keeps up, we'll reach the post in 4 days. And then what? Then we get paid, and we head to the ranch. Clara nodded. She was looking forward to reaching the ranch, to stopping, to not spending every waking hour in the saddle. But part of her was going to miss this. The simplicity of it, the rhythm of moving with the herd, the quiet companionship she'd found with Colt. She didn't know what waited for her at the ranch, but she knew it would be different. Everything would be different. That night, they camped near a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter from the wind. Colt built the fire, and Clara took care of the horses, brushing them down and checking for injuries. One of the mares had a stone bruise on her hoof, and Clara spent 20 minutes working it out, talking to the mare in a low voice until she calmed down. You're good with them, Colt said when Clara came back to the fire. They're easier than people. Colt almost smiled. Can't argue with that. They ate, and Clara pulled out the bedroll Colt had given her a few days earlier. She was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open, but she forced herself to stay awake a little longer. There was something she'd been wanting to ask Colt, something that had been nagging at her since they'd left Red Mesa. Colt? She said. Yeah? Why'd you really pay my debt? Colt was quiet for a long time. Clara thought maybe he wasn't going to answer, that he was going to brush her off the way he always did when she asked something too personal. But then he spoke, his voice low. I had a sister once, he said, younger than me. Her name was Emily. Clara waited, barely breathing. She got mixed up with the wrong people, borrowed money from a man like Crow. When she couldn't pay it back, he sold her to a place in Tucson. By the time I found out, it was too late. She was already dead. Clara's chest tightened. Colt, I'm so sorry. It was 10 years ago. I should have let it go by now. Colt stared at the fire, his jaw tight. But when I saw you in that street, with Crow dragging you around like you were nothing, all I could see was Emily. And I thought maybe I could do for you what I couldn't do for her. Clara didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't have saved his sister, that some things were just beyond anyone's control. But she knew he wouldn't believe her, so instead she just said, Thank you. Colt nodded once, then stood up and walked away from the fire. Clara lay down and closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep for a long time. She kept thinking about Emily, about Colt carrying that guilt for 10 years, about the fact that he'd risked everything to save a stranger because he couldn't save his own sister. It made her understand him in a way she hadn't before. Colt Mercer wasn't just quiet and guarded. He was broken, and he was trying to put himself back together one act of decency at a time. The next day, they ran into trouble. It started with a dust storm that came out of nowhere, rolling across the valley like a wall of dirt and wind. Clara barely had time to pull her bandana over her face before it hit. The horses panicked, scattering in every direction. Clara fought to keep control of the stallion, but the wind was too strong, the dust too thick. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. "Colt!" she shouted, but the wind swallowed her voice. She rode blind, trying to keep the stallion moving in what she hoped was the right direction. The dust stung her eyes and filled her lungs, and she coughed until her throat was raw. She didn't know how long the storm lasted. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. When it finally passed, Clara found herself alone in the middle of nowhere, the herd scattered. No sign of Colt. Panic clawed at her chest. She spun the stallion in a circle, scanning the horizon, but all she saw was empty desert. No horses, no Colt, nothing. "Colt!" she shouted again, louder this time. No answer. Clara forced herself to breathe, to think. The horses would have run downwind, away from the storm. If she followed the wind's direction, she might find them. And if she found the horses, she'd find Colt. She kicked the stallion into a trot, heading east. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands shook on the reins. She kept telling herself Colt was fine, that he knew how to handle a dust storm, that he'd done this 100 times before. But the fear wouldn't let go. She rode for 20 minutes before she saw movement in the distance. Horses. A cluster of them, milling around near a dried-up riverbed. Clara urged the stallion faster, relief flooding through her. As she got closer, she saw Colt on the roan, rounding up the stragglers. He looked up when he heard her coming and nodded once. "You all right?" he called out. "Yeah, you?" "Fine. Lost 3 horses, though." Clara's stomach sank. "3? Where?" "Don't know. They bolted north. We'll have to go find them." Clara wanted to argue, to say they should just let the 3 horses go and focus on keeping the rest of the herd together. But she knew Colt wouldn't do that. Losing 3 horses meant losing money, and losing money meant the whole trip was for nothing. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They left the main herd in the riverbed where the horses had settled and rode north. Clara kept her eyes on the ground, looking for tracks. She'd never tracked anything in her life, but Colt seemed to know what he was doing. He moved slow, studying the dirt, pointing out hoof prints that Clara wouldn't have noticed. They found the first horse an hour later, grazing near a cluster of rocks. Colt roped him easily, and they kept moving. The second horse was farther out, standing in the middle of a dry lake bed, looking lost. Clara rode out and brought him back without too much trouble. The third horse was the problem. They found him at the bottom of a ravine, his leg twisted at an angle that made Clara's stomach turn. He was still alive, but barely. His breathing was labored, and his eyes rolled white with pain. Colt climbed down into the ravine and knelt beside the horse. He ran his hand over the animal's neck, talking to him in a low voice. Then he stood up and pulled his pistol. "Don't watch," he said to Clara. Clara turned away, but she couldn't block out the sound of the gunshot. It echoed through the ravine, sharp and final. When she looked back, Colt was climbing out, his face grim. "We need to get back," he said. They rode in silence. Clara didn't know what to say. She could see the tension in Colt's shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched tight. He hated losing that horse, maybe more than she realized. When they got back to the herd, the sun was starting to set. They made camp quickly, neither of them talking. Clara took care of the horses while Colt built the fire. They ate without speaking, the weight of the day pressing down on them. "I'm sorry about the horse," Clara finally said. "It happens. Still, I know it's not easy." Colt looked at her, and for a second Clara thought she saw something soften in his eyes. "No, it's not." They sat there in this firelight, and Clara felt the distance between them shrink just a little. She didn't know Colt well, but she was starting to understand him. And that was something. They reached the military post 4 days later, 2 horses short, and both of them exhausted down to their bones. The post sat at the edge of a flat plain, surrounded by wooden walls that looked like they'd been patched together from whatever lumber the army could scavenge. A flag hung limp in the still air, and soldiers moved between buildings with the kind of bored efficiency that came from doing the same tasks day after day. Colt rode up to the gate, Clara beside him, the remaining horses trailing behind. A sergeant with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes stepped out to meet them. "You Mercer?" the sergeant asked. "I am." "You're late." "Had some trouble on the way." The sergeant walked around the herd, counting heads, his expression souring with each number. "Contract was for 30 horses. I count 28. Lost one to a broken leg. Another bolted during a dust storm. Couldn't find him. Contract says 30. Colt's jaw tightened. "I know what the contract says." The sergeant crossed his arms. "Then you know I can't pay full price for 28 horses." Clara watched Colt's hands curl into fists at his sides. She could feel the tension rolling off him, could see the way his shoulders went rigid. He'd worked for 2 weeks to get these horses here, had barely slept, had lost money on supplies and time, and now this sergeant was going to short him because of 2 horses. "The horses we brought are in good condition," Clara said before she could stop herself. "Better than good. You won't find stock like this anywhere else." The sergeant turned his attention to her, his eyebrows raised. "That right?" "That's right. You want quality animals? You pay for quality animals. 2 horses don't change that." The sergeant studied her for a long moment, then looked back at Colt. "She always this mouthy?" "Only when she's right," Colt said. The sergeant grunted, then pulled a pouch from his belt and counted out bills. He handed them to Colt, keeping 2 back. "That's for 28. Take it or leave it." Colt took the money without a word, stuffed it into his coat, and turned his horse around. Clara followed, her heart still hammering. She'd never spoken up like that before, never challenged someone with authority. Part of her expected the sergeant to call them back, to throw them out, or worse. But he just watched them go, and when Clara glanced back, he was already directing his men to take the horses. They rode away from the post in silence. When they were a mile out, Colt finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that. I know. Could have made things worse. But it didn't." Colt looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "You're getting bolder. Is that a bad thing?" "No." He almost smiled. "Just don't make a habit of picking fights with armed soldiers." "I'll try." They camped that night under a sky so clear it felt like the stars were close enough to touch. Clara lay on her back, staring up, and for the first time in weeks she felt something close to contentment. The horses were delivered, the job was done. Tomorrow they'd head to Colt's ranch, and maybe, just maybe, her life would start to feel normal again. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. 3 days if we push, 4 if we take it easy." "Can we take it easy?" Colt chuckled. "Yeah, we can take it easy." Clara closed her eyes, listening to the crackling fire and the sound of Colt moving around the camp. She was asleep before he settled down for the night. The next morning, they started north. The landscape changed again, shifting from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and twisted juniper trees. The air was cooler here, the heat less oppressive. Clara could see mountains in the distance, their peaks still dusted with snow, even though it was late summer. "That's where we're headed," Colt said, nodding toward the mountains. "Ranch is in the valley on the other side." "It's beautiful," Clara said, and she meant it. "It's isolated. Nearest town is 2 days' ride. You get snowed in during winter, you're stuck until spring. Sounds perfect." Colt glanced at her. "You say that now." "I mean it. I'm tired of towns, tired of people. Towns have supplies, doctors, law. Towns also have men like Silas Crow." Colt didn't argue with that. They rode through the afternoon, stopping only to water the horses and stretch their legs. Clara's body had toughened over the last 2 weeks, the constant riding building muscle where there hadn't been any before. She didn't ache the way she used to, didn't feel like she was going to fall apart every time she climbed off the horse. She was stronger now. She could feel it. That night they made a camp near a stream that cut through the hills like a silver ribbon. Clara washed her face and hands in the cold water, scrubbing away 2 weeks' worth of dust and sweat. When she looked up, Colt was watching her, his expression thoughtful. "What?" Clara asked. "You've changed," he said. "How?" "You're not scared anymore." Clara thought about that. He was right. She wasn't scared. Not the way she'd been in Red Mesa. Not the way she'd been when Crow's men had chased them. She was still wary, still cautious, but the fear that had lived in her chest for so long had faded into something manageable. "I guess I have," she said. Colt nodded. "Good. They ate dinner and Clara asked Colt about the ranch. He told her about the house he'd built with his own hands, the barn that needed repairs, the creek that ran through the property year-round. He talked more than he usually did, and Clara listened, building a picture in her mind of the place she was heading toward. It sounded quiet, peaceful, exactly what she needed. "You ever get lonely out there?" she asked. "Sometimes." "Why don't you hire help? You said you work alone, but it seems like you could use the extra hands." Colt was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I had help once, a couple of ranch hands, good men, but I got used to being alone after they left. It's easier that way." "Easier how?" "You don't have to worry about anyone but yourself." Clara frowned. "That sounds lonely." "Maybe, but it's safe." Clara didn't push, but she thought she understood. Colt had lost people, his sister, maybe others, and he decided that keeping his distance was the only way to protect himself from losing anyone else. It was a sad way to live, but she couldn't judge him for it. She'd been doing the same thing in Red Mesa, keeping everyone at arm's length, building walls to keep the herd out. "Well," Clara said, "you've got me now? At least for a while." Colt looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess I do." They reached the ranch 2 days later, and Clara's first thought was that it looked exactly like Colt had described it, quiet, isolated, and rough around the edges. The house was small, made of logs and stone, with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The barn was bigger, its roof patched with mismatched planks, and there was a corral out back that looked like it could hold maybe a dozen horses. Beyond the buildings, the valley stretched out in every direction, green and gold and empty. "It's not much," Colt said as they rode up. "It's perfect," Clara said, and she meant it. Colt dismounted and led his horse into the barn. Clara followed, looking around. The barn smelled like hay and leather, and something earthy she couldn't quite place. There were stalls along one side, a tack room in the back, and a loft overhead stuffed with more hay. It was clean, organized, and clearly well cared for. "You can take the spare room in the house," Colt said. "It's small, but it's got a bed and a window." "Thank you." Colt nodded and started unsaddling his horse. Clara did the same, working in comfortable silence. When the horses were settled, Colt led her into the house. The inside was as simple as the outside. One main room with a fireplace, a table, and a couple of chairs, a small kitchen in the corner, and 2 doors leading to what Clara assumed were bedrooms. It was sparse, almost bare, but it was clean. "Make yourself at home," Colt said. "I'll get a fire going." Clara walked into the spare room and set her pack down. The room was tiny, just big enough for a narrow bed and a small dresser, but it had a window that looked out over the valley, and that was enough. She sat on the bed, testing the mattress, and felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't running. She wasn't afraid. She was just here. That night, Colt cooked a real meal, beans and salt pork and cornbread that was only slightly burned. Clara ate until she thought she might burst, and when she was done, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "That was the best meal I've had in months," she said. "Don't get used to it. I'm not much of a cook." "Better than dried meat." Colt smiled, and Clara realized it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, less guarded. She liked it. "So what happens now?" Clara asked. "Now you rest. Tomorrow we'll start working on the ranch. There's plenty to do." "Like what?" "Fences need mending. Barn roof needs patching. I've got 6 horses that need breaking. Take your pick." Clara nodded. "I can do that." "I know you can." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe she could build a life here, away from men like Crow, away from towns that didn't care if she lived or died. Maybe she could be more than just a woman who'd been dragged through the dirt and sold like property. But that hope lasted exactly 3 days. On the 3rd morning, Clara was in the barn checking on the horses when she heard riders approaching. She stepped outside and saw 3 men on horseback, all of them armed, all of them wearing the kind of hard expressions that meant trouble. Colt was already walking toward them, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Can I help you?" Colt called out. The man in the lead, tall, with a scar running down his cheek, climbed down from his horse. "You Colt Mercer?" "I am. We're here on behalf of Silas Crow." Clara's stomach dropped. She stepped out of the barn, her heart pounding, and the scarred man's eyes flicked to her. "There she is," he said, grinning. "Mr. Crow's been looking for you, miss." "She's not going anywhere," Colt said, his voice flat. The scarred man laughed. "That's not your decision to make. Mr. Crow says the debt wasn't settled properly. Says you paid it under duress, which makes the contract void." "That's a lie," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, Mr. Crow wants his property back." "She's not property," Colt said. The scarred man's smile faded. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mercer. Just hand her over and we'll leave." "No." The scarred man sighed, then nodded to the other two men. They dismounted, their hands moving to their guns. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment everything fell apart. "Last chance," the scarred man said. Colt didn't move. "Get off my land!" The scarred man drew his gun, and Clara screamed, but Colt was faster. He pulled his pistol and fired, the shot echoing across the valley. The scarred man stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. The other two men hesitated, and Colt aimed at them. "Next one won't be a warning," Colt said. The two men looked at their leader, then at Colt, then at each other. After a long moment, they helped the scarred man onto his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and blood behind. Clara's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the ground. Colt walked over to her, his gun still in his hand. "You okay?" he asked. Clara nodded, even though she wasn't. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No, he's not." "What do we do?" Colt holstered his gun and looked out at the valley, his jaw tight. "We end this." Clara stared at him. "How?" "We go to Red Mesa. We face Crow. And we make sure he never comes after you again." "That's suicide." "Maybe. But it's the only way this ends." Clara wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way, but she knew he was right. Crow wasn't going to give up. He'd keep sending men, keep pushing, until someone was dead. And if they didn't stop him now, it would be her or Colt. "When do we leave?" Clara asked. "Tomorrow morning." "Okay." Colt helped her to her feet and they walked back to the house. Clara's hands were shaking and her mind was racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. Tomorrow, they'd ride back to Red Mesa. Tomorrow, they'd face Silas Crow. And tomorrow, one way or another, this would be over. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the yard over and over. She'd seen men die before, her father, the horse Colt had put down, but she'd never seen someone shot. Never seen the blood, the shock in the scarred man's eyes. It had been fast, brutal, and terrifying. She got up and walked into the main room. Colt was sitting at the table, cleaning his gun by lamplight. He looked up when she came in. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No, me neither." Clara sat down across from him, watching as he worked. His hands moved with practiced ease, disassembling the gun, wiping down each piece, reassembling it. It was methodical, almost meditative. "Are you scared?" Clara asked. Colt paused, then nodded. "Yeah. Me too." "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." Clara leaned back in her chair. "What if we don't make it?" "Then we don't." "That's it? That's your answer?" Colt looked at her, his eyes steady. "I've been running from men like Crow my whole life. I'm tired of running. If tomorrow's the day I stop, then that's how it is." "But you could die." "So could you. So could anyone. That's life." Clara didn't know what to say to that. Colt went back to cleaning his gun, and Clara sat there watching him, trying to understand how he could be so calm. Maybe it was because he'd already lost everything that mattered. Maybe it was because he'd made peace with the idea of dying a long time ago. Or maybe he was just better at hiding his fear than she was. "For what it's worth," Claire said quietly, "I'm glad you're here." Colt looked at her, and something softened in his expression. "I'm glad you're here too." They sat there in the lamplight, two people who'd been broken by the world and were trying to put themselves back together. Clara didn't know if they'd survive tomorrow. She didn't know if facing Crow would change anything or if it would just be another mistake in a long line of mistakes. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let Colt face it alone. The next morning, they rode out before dawn. The valley was quiet, the air cool and still, and Clara tried to memorize the way it looked, the way the light hit the mountains, the the way the grass swayed in the breeze. If this was the last time she saw it, she wanted to remember. They rode in silence for most of the day, the tension between them thick but not uncomfortable. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, watching for riders, but the desert was empty. It was like the land was holding its breath, waiting to see what happened next. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd made different choices?" Clara asked. "Every day." "What would you change?" Colt thought about that for a while. "I would have left home sooner, would have taken Emily with me. Maybe we could have avoided all this." "You can't know that." "No, but I can wish it." Clara nodded. "I wish I'd left Red Mesa before my father died. Wish I'd seen what Crow was before it was too late." "You were just trying to survive." "So were you." Colt glanced at her, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something else, something that explained the weight he carried. But he just turned back to the road and kept riding. They reached Red Mesa just after sunset. The town looked the same as it had the day Clara left, dusty, tired, and full of people who didn't care about anything but their own survival. Colt rode straight to the saloon, the biggest building on the main street, and dismounted. Clara followed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Stay close," Colt said. "I'm not going anywhere." They walked into the saloon and every head turned. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that meant people were deciding whether to run or fight. Colt walked to the bar, his hand resting on his gun, and looked at the bartender. "Where's Crow?" Colt asked. The bartender's eyes flicked to the back of the room, where a door led to a private area. "He's in the back. Tell him Colt Mercer's here to see him." The bartender hesitated, then nodded and disappeared through the door. Clara stood beside Colt, her hands clenched into fists. She could feel the eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting. The woman Crow tried to sell, the one who got away. She ignored them. A minute later, the door opened and Silas Crow stepped out. He looked exactly the same, tall, thin, sharp-edged, and dangerous. His eyes landed on Clara, and he smiled. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I was wondering when you'd come back." "I didn't come back for you," Clara said. "No?" Crow's smile widened. "Then why are you here?" "To tell you to leave us alone." Crow laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Is that so? And what makes you think I'll listen?" "Because if you don't," Colt said, his voice low, "I'll make sure you regret it." Crow's smile faded. "You threatening me, Mercer?" "I'm promising you." The room went silent again. Crow stared at Colt, his eyes narrowing, and Clara could see the wheels turning in his head. He was deciding whether Colt was bluffing, whether he could call his bluff, whether it was worth the risk. "You shot one of my men," Crow said finally. "He drew first." "That's not how I heard it." "Then you heard wrong." Crow took a step forward, and Clara's hand moved to the knife she'd tucked into her belt. Colt didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring Crow down, and Clara realized something. Colt wasn't afraid. He'd meant what he said last night. He was done running. "You can't win this," Crow said. "I own this town. I own everyone in it. You're just one man." "Maybe," Colt said, "but one man's enough." Crow's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." "I've regretted a lot of things. One more won't kill me." Crow stared at Colt for a long moment, then turned his gaze to Clara. "You think he can protect you? He can't. Sooner or later you'll be back where you started, and I'll be waiting." "No," Clara said, her voice steady. "I won't." Crow's expression darkened, and for a second Clara thought he was going to draw his gun, but then he smiled again, that cold, empty smile, and turned away. "Get out of my town," he said over his shoulder. Colt didn't move. "Not until you promise you'll leave her alone." Crow stopped, his back to them. The room was so quiet Clara could hear her own heartbeat. Then Crow turned around, his hand resting on his gun. "You want a promise?" he said. "Here's my promise. I'll bury you both." And then everything exploded into chaos. Crow's hand moved toward his gun, and Colt's moved faster. The shot cracked through the saloon before Clara could blink, and Crow's hat flew off his head, landing somewhere behind the bar. Crow froze, his hand still hovering over his weapon, his eyes wide with shock. "Next one's in your chest," Colt said, his gun steady. The room erupted. Men dove for cover, knocking over chairs and tables. Someone screamed. The bartender dropped behind the bar. Clara's hand found the knife at her belt, her whole body coiled tight, waiting for someone to make a move. But nobody did. They all just stayed frozen, watching Crow, waiting to see what he'd do next. Crow slowly raised his hands, his face twisted with rage. "You just signed your death warrant." "Maybe, but you'll be dead before me. You think killing me solves anything? I've got men everywhere. They'll hunt you down." "Then let them try." Clara watched the two men stare each other down, and she realized something that made her stomach drop. Colt wasn't going to shoot. He'd fired the warning shot to prove he could, but he wasn't going to kill Crow. Not here. Not like this. And Crow knew it. "You're weak," Crow said, lowering his hands slowly, "just like your sister was." Colt's jaw tightened, and Clara saw his finger twitch on the trigger. For a second, she thought he was going to do it. But then he lowered the gun slightly, and Crow's smile came back. "That's what I thought," Crow said. "You don't have the stomach for this." "Colt," Clara said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We should go." Colt didn't move. His eyes were locked on Crow, and Clara could see something dangerous building behind them. She stepped closer, putting herself between Colt and Crow. "Colt," she said again, louder this time. "We're leaving." Colt finally looked at her, and the focus came back into his eyes. He nodded once, then back toward the door, his gun still trained on Crow. Clara followed, her heart hammering, her eyes scanning the room for anyone stupid enough to try something. They made it outside without anyone shooting at them, but Clara knew it wasn't over. They mounted their horses and rode out of town fast, not looking back. Clara's hands shook on the reins, and her breath came in short gasps. They'd walked into Crow's territory and walked back out alive, but it felt like a loss. "Why didn't you shoot him?" Clara asked when they were a mile outside Red Mesa. "Because killing him wouldn't have solved anything. It would have ended this." "No. It would have started something worse." Colt kept his eyes on the road ahead. "You kill a man like Crow, his people come after you for revenge. They don't stop until you're dead, or they are. I shoot him in that saloon, we'd be fighting his men for the rest of our lives. So what was the point? We just made him angrier." "The point was to show him we're not afraid, that we'll fight if we have to." Clara didn't think that was enough, but she didn't argue. They rode hard for the next hour, putting distance between themselves and Red Mesa. When they finally slowed down, the sun was gone and the stars were starting to come out. "Where are we going?" Clara asked. "Back to the ranch. We'll figure out the rest from there." Clara nodded, even though she didn't think there was much to figure out. Crow had promised to bury them, and she believed him. It was only a matter of time before he made good on that promise. They rode through the night, stopping only to rest the horses. By the time they reached the ranch, Clara was so exhausted she could barely stay upright. Colt helped her down from the horse, and they stumbled into the house. Clara collapsed onto the bed in the spare room without bothering to undress. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. She woke to the sound of hammering. It took her a moment to remember where she was, and when she did, she sat up fast, her heart racing. But the house was quiet. The hammering was coming from outside. She got up, splashed water on her face from the basin Colt had left in the room, and walked out onto the porch. Colt was on the barn roof, replacing the broken planks he'd mentioned. He worked with the same methodical focus he brought to everything, his movements efficient and sure. Clara watched him for a minute, then walked over. "You've been up all night," she called up. "Couldn't sleep. You should rest." "I'll rest when the roof's fixed." Clara shook her head, but didn't push. She went back inside, found some bread and cheese in the kitchen, and made breakfast. When Colt finally came down from the roof an hour later, she had coffee waiting for him. "Thanks," he said, sitting down at the table. They ate in silence. Clara wanted to ask what happened next, what their plan was, but she didn't know how to start. She kept thinking about Crow's face, the way he'd looked at Colt like he knew he'd already won. "You think he'll come here?" Clara finally asked. "Yeah, eventually." "When?" "Could be days, could be weeks. Men like Crow like to let you sweat first." Clara set down her coffee. "So we just wait?" "We prepare. Fix the fences, reinforce the barn, stock up on supplies, make this place defensible." "You really think we can hold off Crow's men?" Colt looked at her, and for the first time Clara saw doubt in his eyes. "I don't know, but we're going to try." They spent the next week preparing. Colt worked on the fences, replacing rotted posts and stringing new wire. Clara helped where she could, learning as she went. She also started practicing with the rifle Colt gave her, setting up targets behind the barn and firing until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. She wasn't a great shot, but she was getting better. Good enough to hit something if she had to. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. Colt told her more about his sister, about the guilt that had eaten at him for years. Clara told him about her mother, about watching the desert slowly kill her spirit. They talked about things they'd never told anyone else, and slowly, the walls between them came down. "You ever think about leaving?" Clara asked one night. "Just riding away and starting over somewhere else?" "Every day." "Why don't you?" "Because running doesn't fix anything. It just delays the problem." Clara poked at the fire with a stick. "What if there's no fixing it? What if Crow's right and we can't win?" "Then we go down fighting, but we don't run." Clara looked at him, at the stubborn set of his jaw, and she realized something. Colt wasn't fighting for the ranch or even for her. He was fighting because he needed to prove to himself that he could, that he wasn't the man who'd failed to save his sister, that he could stand his ground and not break. "I'm not going to let you do this alone," Clara said. "I know. I mean it. If Crow comes, I fight too." Colt studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." 2 weeks after they'd confronted Crow in Red Mesa, a rider came to the ranch. Clara saw him first, a lone figure approaching from the east. She called out to Colt, who was in the barn, and he came out with his rifle. But the rider wasn't one of Crow's men. It was the bartender from the saloon, an older man with gray hair and a nervous expression. He pulled up near the house and climbed down from his horse, his hands raised. "I'm not armed," he said quickly. "Just came to talk." Colt lowered the rifle slightly but didn't put it down. "What do you want?" "I came to warn you. Crow's gathering men. He's planning to ride out here in the next few days." Clara's stomach dropped. "How many men?" 10, maybe 12, all of them armed. He's offering $100 to anyone who brings you back alive, Miss Whitmore. 200 if they kill Mercer." Colt's expression didn't change, but Clara saw his knuckles go white on the rifle. "Why are you telling us this?" The bartender shifted uncomfortably. "Because what Crow's doing ain't right. Never has been. Most folks in town are too scared to say anything, but I've had enough. I figured you deserve to know what's coming." "Appreciated," Colt said. The bartender nodded, climbed back onto his horse, and rode off without another word. Clara watched him go, then turned to Colt. 10 or 12 men, she said quietly. "We can't fight that many. We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do. We can leave. Head north, cross into Colorado. Crow can't follow us there." "He'll follow us anywhere, and even if he doesn't, someone else will. You think Crow's the only man out there who'd sell you to pay a debt? The frontier's full of men like him." Claire wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Running wouldn't solve anything. It would just delay the inevitable. "So what do we do?" she asked. Colt looked around the ranch, his eyes taking in the house, the barn, the valley beyond. "We fortify. We stock up on ammunition, and we make sure that when Crow comes, he regrets it." They spent the next 2 days preparing for war. Colt boarded up the windows in the house, leaving small gaps to shoot through. He stacked hay bales in the barn to create cover and moved all the horses into the far corral, away from the buildings. Clara filled every container they had with water and moved all their supplies into the house. They worked from dawn until well past dark, barely stopping to eat or rest. On the third day, Clara woke before dawn and walked outside. The valley was quiet, the air cool and still. She stood on the porch, looking out at the mountains, and tried to memorize the way it looked. If this was the last time she saw it, she wanted to remember. Colt came out a few minutes later, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed her one and stood beside her. "You ready?" he asked. "No." "Me neither." They stood there in silence, drinking their coffee, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, Clara saw them, riders on the horizon, moving fast. She counted 12 of them, just like the bartender had said. Crow was in the lead, his black coat unmistakable even from a distance. "Here we go," Colt said. They went inside and Colt barred the door. Clara took up position at one of the windows, rifle in hand, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Colt moved to the window on the opposite side, his rifle already loaded and ready. The riders pulled up 50 yards from the house and stopped. Crow dismounted and the others followed. They fanned out, surrounding the house, their guns drawn. Crow walked forward until he was just outside the fence. "Mercer," he called out. "I know you're in there. Send the girl out and we'll let you live." Colt didn't answer. "Come on, Mercer. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're outnumbered. You can't win." "Go to hell, Crow," Clara shouted before she could stop herself. Crow's eyes found the window where she was hiding, and he smiled. "There you are, Miss Whitmore. I've missed you." "The feeling's not mutual," Crow laughed. "Still got that fire, I see. Good. Madam Lacey likes her girls spirited." Claire's hands tightened on the rifle. She wanted to shoot him right there, to wipe that smile off his face, but she knew she'd only get one shot. She had to make it count. "Last chance, Mercer," Crow called out. "Send her out, or we're coming in." Colt fired a shot into the dirt at Crow's feet. Crow jumped back, his smile gone. "That's your answer?" Crow shouted. "Fine, boys, burn them out." Two of Crow's men ran forward with torches, and Clara's breath caught. They were going to set the house on fire. She aimed at one of them and fired. The shot went wide, hitting the ground a few feet away. She cursed, reloaded, and fired again. This time she hit him in the leg. He went down screaming, dropping the torch. Colt took out the second man with a clean shot to the chest. The man fell, and the torch rolled harmlessly into the dirt. The other men scattered, taking cover behind rocks and trees. Crow retreated to his horse, his face twisted with rage. "Keep them pinned," he shouted. "Don't let them out." Gunfire erupted from every direction. Bullets slammed into the walls, shattered what was left of the windows, tore through the boarded shutters. Clara ducked down, her ears ringing, her whole body shaking. She forced herself to breathe, to focus. She popped back up, aimed at a man hiding behind a tree, and fired. She missed, but it was close enough to make him duck. Colt was firing methodically, taking his time with each shot. Clara saw one of Crow's men drop, then another. But there were still too many of them, and they were closing in. "They're trying to flank us," Clara shouted. "I see them! Cover the back window!" Clara ran to the window facing the barn and saw two men creeping around the side of the building. She aimed and fired, hitting one of them in the shoulder. He stumbled back, clutching his arm, and the other man grabbed him and dragged him back into cover. The gunfire was relentless. Clara reloaded as fast as she could, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. She could smell smoke and gunpowder, could taste fear in the back of her throat. She fired again and again, not even sure if she was hitting anything. "Colt!" she shouted. "We can't hold them off forever." "I know, just keep shooting." A bullet punched through the wall, inches from Clara's head, and she dropped to the floor, her heart hammering. She crawled to the next window, popped up, and fired blindly. She had no idea if she hit anything, but it didn't matter. She just needed to keep them back. Colt's rifle clicked empty, and he swore. "I'm out!" "There's more ammunition in the bedroom," Clara shouted. Colt ran to the bedroom and came back with a box of bullets. He reloaded and moved back to the window. Clara saw him sight down the barrel, saw him exhale slowly, saw him fire. One of Crow's men fell, and the others hesitated. "They're pulling back," Clara shouted. She was right. Crow's men were retreating, dragging their wounded with them. Crow himself was still on his horse, 50 yards out, watching. Clara could see the fury on his face, the realization that this wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Regroup," Crow shouted. "We'll wait them out. They can't stay in there forever." The gunfire stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Clara slumped against the wall, her whole body shaking. She looked at Colt, who was checking his rifle, his face grim. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Clara asked. "Enough for maybe another fight like that. Maybe not." "And then what?" "Then we improvise." Clara let out a shaky laugh. "That's your plan? Improvise? You got a better one?" Clara didn't. She crawled over to the window and peeked out. Crow's men had set up camp 50 yards away, just out of rifle range. They were settling in, building a fire, clearly planning to wait. Crow was right. They couldn't stay in the house forever. Eventually, they'd run out of water, food, or ammunition. And when they did, Crow would move in. "We need help," Clara said. "There's nobody to help us." "What about the town? The people who live there?" "Somebody has to be willing to stand up to Crow." Colt shook his head. "You saw them. They're too scared." "Then we make them less scared. We show them Crow can be beaten." "And how do we do that?" Clara thought for a moment, an idea forming. It was risky, maybe even stupid, but it was the only thing she could think of. "We go out there. We challenge him, in front of his men, make him look weak. Colt stared at her like she'd lost her mind. That's suicide. Maybe. But if we stay here, we die anyway. At least this way we have a chance. Colt was quiet for a long time, his jaw working. Then he nodded slowly. All right, but we do it my way. What's your way? We wait until dark, then we sneak out, circle around, and take out as many of his men as we can before they know what's happening. When there's only a few left, we confront Crow. Clara nodded. It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than sitting in the house and waiting to die. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Colt sharpened his knife and checked his guns. Clara did the same, her hands steadier now that she had something to do. When the sun finally set and darkness fell over the valley, they were ready. Colt unbarred the back door, the one facing away from Crow's camp, and they slipped out into the night. The air was cool, and the stars were so bright they cast faint shadows. Clara followed Colt, moving as quietly as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. They circled wide, staying low, using the rocks and brush for cover. It took them 20 minutes to get into position behind Crow's camp. Clara could see the men sitting around the fire, talking and laughing, passing a bottle between them. They looked relaxed, confident. They didn't think Colt and Clara would be stupid enough to come after them. Colt signaled to Clara, and they moved closer. When they were within 10 yards, Colt raised his rifle and fired. One of the men dropped. Before the others could react, Clara fired, hitting another man in the shoulder. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled for their guns, shouting, trying to figure out where the shots were coming from. Colt fired again, and another man went down. Clara aimed at a figure near the fire and squeezed the trigger, but her shot went wide. The man turned and fired back, and the bullet whizzed past Clara's ear. She ducked behind a rock, her breath coming fast. "Keep moving," Colt shouted. "Don't let them pin you down." Clara ran to the next rock, reloading as she went. She popped up and fired, hitting a man in the leg. He fell, screaming, and the others scattered. Colt was moving too, firing and reloading with practiced ease. Clara saw another man drop, then another. Within minutes, half of Crow's men were down, and the rest were running. Clara stood up, her rifle still raised, and scanned the camp. Crow was gone. She looked around, her heart sinking, and then she heard the sound of hooves. Crow was riding away, disappearing into the darkness. "Colt!" she shouted. "He's getting away!" Colt ran to where the horses were tied and jumped onto one. Clara followed, mounting the horse beside him. They rode hard, chasing the sound of Crow's horse through the night. The desert was a blur around them, the stars overhead, the wind whipping past Clara's face. They caught up to Crow near the edge of the valley. He turned his horse to face them, his gun drawn. Clara and Colt pulled up, forming a triangle with him, all three of them breathing hard. "This is over, Crow," Colt said. Crow laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "It's never over. Even if you kill me, someone else will come. Someone always does." "Maybe, but it won't be you." Crow raised his gun, and Clara raised hers. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Crow smiled, that cold, empty smile, and said, "You think you won? You didn't win. You just bought yourself a little time." And then he turned his horse and rode off into the darkness. Clara lowered her gun, her hands shaking. Colt watched Crow disappear, then turned his horse back toward the ranch. "Why didn't you shoot him?" Clara asked. "Because he's right. Killing him doesn't end this. It just makes us killers." "So what now?" "Now we go home, and we live." They rode back to the ranch in silence. The house was still standing, scarred but intact. Clara dismounted and looked around at the valley, at the mountains in the distance, at the place she'd started to think of as home. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't safe, but it was hers, and that was enough. The next morning, Clara woke to find Colt already outside, surveying the damage. Bullet holes peppered the walls of the house, shattered glass littered the porch, and the fence near the barn had been torn apart. But they were alive. The ranch was still standing, and Crow was gone. Clara walked out onto the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cool morning air. Colt was standing near the corral, staring out at the valley, his shoulders tense. "You think he'll come back?" Clara asked. Colt didn't turn around. "I don't know, maybe." "But you don't think so?" "I think we hurt him, made him look weak in front of his men. That's worse than losing money or property. Men like Crow, they can't afford to look weak. Clara walked over and stood beside him. So what does that mean? It means he'll either come back with twice as many men to prove he can still win, or he'll cut his losses and move on to easier prey. Which one do you think he'll do? Colt finally looked at her. Honestly, I think we broke something in him last night. He rode away instead of fighting. That's not something a man like Crow does unless he's already lost. Clara wanted to believe that, but she'd seen the look in Crow's eyes when he'd ridden off. It wasn't defeat. It was something else, something calculating, like he was already planning his next move. I'm not letting my guard down, Clara said. Good. Neither am I. They spent the rest of the day cleaning up and repairing what they could. Clara picked up shattered glass, boarded up the broken windows, and helped Colt patch the holes in the walls. It was slow, exhausting work, but it felt good. It felt like taking back control. 3 days passed, and Crow didn't come back. Neither did any of his men. The valley was quiet, peaceful even, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something. On the 4th day, the bartender from Red Mesa rode up to the ranch again, this time with someone else, a woman Clara didn't recognize. Colt met them at the gate, rifle in hand. What do you want? What? The bartender climbed down from his horse, his hands raised. We're not here to cause trouble. This is Margaret Hollis. She runs the boarding house in Red Mesa. The woman, Margaret, was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and sharp eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. She climbed down from her horse and looked at Clara. You're the girl Crow tried to sell, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. I am, Clara said. Margaret nodded. I came to tell you something. Crow left town 2 days ago, packed up everything he owned and rode out. Nobody knows where he went. Clara's breath caught. He's gone? Gone, Margaret confirmed, and good riddance. That man's been bleeding this town dry for years. People are too scared to say it out loud, but everyone's relieved. Clara looked at Colt, and she saw the same cautious hope in his eyes that she felt in her chest. You think it's true? She asked him. Could be. Or it could be a trap. Margaret shook her head. It's not a trap. I wouldn't have ridden all the way out here if I wasn't sure. Crow's gone. His house is empty. His bank accounts are closed. He's done. Why would he just leave? Clara asked. Because you made him look like a fool, the bartender said. Word got around about what happened out here, how 2 people held off a dozen armed men and sent Crow running. People started asking questions, started wondering why they'd been so afraid of him all these years. Crow knew he was losing control, so he left before things got worse. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight for weeks. So it's over. It's over, Margaret said. You're free. Free. The word felt strange in Clara's mouth, like something she didn't quite know how to use. She'd spent so long running, so long afraid, that she didn't know what to do with freedom now that she had it. Thank you for telling us, Colt said. Margaret nodded. There's something else. The town's been talking about what you did, about how you stood up to Crow when nobody else would. Some folks want to help you rebuild. Others want to know if you've got work. The Mercer Ranch has a reputation now. Colt looked surprised. What kind of reputation? The kind that says you don't back down. The kind that says you take care of your own. Margaret smiled. People respect that. Clara felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. She looked at Colt, and she could see he felt it too, even if he was trying not to show it. Tell them we appreciate the offer, Colt said, and if anyone needs work, they can come by. We'll see what we can do. Margaret and the bartender climbed back onto their horses and rode off, leaving Clara and Colt standing in the yard. Clara turned to Colt, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It's really over, she said. Looks like it. What do we do now? Colt looked around the ranch, at the house they'd defended, at the valley that stretched out beyond. We live, we build, we keep going. Clara nodded. Yeah, we do. Over the next few weeks, people started showing up at the ranch. First, it was a young man named Thomas who'd worked for Crow and wanted out. Then it was a family, a husband, wife, and 2 kids who'd lost their farm and needed a place to stay. Then more. People who'd heard about what happened, people who were tired of being afraid, people who wanted to be part of something different. Colt hired Thomas to help with the horses, and the family moved into the bunkhouse Colt had started building years ago but never finished. Clara found herself managing more than just horses. She was organizing work schedules, dividing up tasks, making sure everyone had what they needed. It was exhausting, but it was the good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from building something instead of just surviving. One evening, about a month after Crow had left, Clara sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley. The ranch looked different now. There were more buildings, more fences, more horses in the corrals. There were children playing near the barn, and she could hear laughter coming from the bunkhouse. It felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Colt came out and sat beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed her one, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Clara asked. "All the time. If you hadn't ridden into Red Mesa that day, I'd be dead or worse. Maybe. Or maybe you would have found another way out." Clara shook her head. "I don't think so. I'd given up. I thought my life was over." Colt sipped his coffee. "You didn't give up. You got on that horse with me. You rode across the desert. You fought when you had to. That's not giving up." "I was scared the whole time." "Being scared doesn't mean you gave up. It just means you're human." Clara looked at him, and she realized how much he'd changed too. He wasn't as guarded anymore, wasn't as closed off. He smiled more, talked more, let people in. Saving her had saved him too, in a way. It had given him a reason to stop punishing himself for what happened to his sister. "I'm glad you were there," Clara said quietly. "Me too." They sat there as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Clara thought about the woman she'd been 2 months ago, scared, desperate, dragged through the dirt like she was nothing. That woman felt like a stranger now. Clara had changed. She was stronger, braver, more sure of herself. She'd learned that she could survive things she never thought possible. She'd learned that she didn't need someone to save her. She could save herself. But she'd also learned that letting people in wasn't weakness, that accepting help wasn't the same as being helpless. Colt had taught her that. And she'd taught him something too, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to do better in the present. A few weeks later, Clara was in the barn when Thomas came running in, out of breath. "Miss Whitmore, there's someone here to see you." Clara set down the brush she'd been using on one of the horses and walked outside. A woman was standing near the house, looking around nervously. She was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and scared eyes. Clara recognized that look. She'd seen it in the mirror enough times. "Can I help you?" Clara asked. The woman turned, and Clara saw the bruises on her face, the way she held herself like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. "I heard about you," the woman said quietly. "About what you did. About how you got away from Silas Crow." Clara's chest tightened. "What's your name?" "Anna." "What happened to you, Anna?" Anna's eyes filled with tears. "My husband. He's not a good man. I tried to leave, but he found me, dragged me back. I don't know where else to go." Clara walked over and put a hand on Anna's shoulder. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. But if he comes, then we'll deal with it, together." Anna looked at Clara, and something shifted in her expression. Hope. Clara knew that look too. Over the next few months, more women showed up. Women who'd heard about the ranch, about the woman who'd stood up to Silas Crow and won. Women who needed a place to hide, to heal, to start over. Clara took them all in. She found them work, gave them a place to sleep, taught them how to defend themselves. The ranch became more than just a horse operation. It became a refuge. Colt watched it all happen, and he didn't try to stop it. If anything, he encouraged it. He built more bunkhouses, hired more workers, expanded the operation to handle the growing number of people. The Mercer Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where people could go when they had nowhere else, a place where you could start over. One evening, about 6 months after Crow had left, Clara stood on the porch and looked out at the ranch. There were 15 people living there now, maybe more. Children played in the yard. Women worked alongside men, breaking horses, mending fences, hauling supplies. It was chaotic and loud and messy, but it was beautiful. Colt came up beside her, and she leaned into him without thinking. He put an arm around her shoulders, and they stood there together, watching the life they'd built. "You know what's funny?" Clara said. "What?" "Crow thought he was selling me, thought he was getting rid of a problem, but all he did was set me free. And now I'm helping other people get free too. Colt smiled. I don't think he saw that coming. No, I don't think he did. Clara thought about Crow sometimes, wondered where he'd gone, if he was still alive, if he ever thought about the woman he'd tried to destroy. But mostly, she didn't think about him at all. He didn't deserve space in her head. He was the past, and she was done living in the past. Winter came and the valley turned white with snow. The ranch slowed down, the work shifting to maintenance and preparation for spring. Clara spent more time inside teaching the younger women how to read and write, how to keep accounts, how to run a business. She was good at it, better than she'd expected. Turned out surviving had taught her skills she didn't know she had. One night, Clara was sitting by the fire when Colt came in from checking on the horses. He stomped the snow off his boots and sat down beside her. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About making this official, the ranch, what we're doing here. I want to file papers, make it legal, a place where people can come and not worry about being dragged back to wherever they ran from. Clara looked at him. You want to make it a sanctuary? Yeah, something like that. That's going to make enemies, people who don't like what we're doing. I know, but we've faced worse. Clara thought about it, then nodded. All right, let's do it. They filed the papers that spring, and the Mercer Ranch officially became a registered homestead and refuge. The news spread fast, and with it came both support and opposition. Some towns sent supplies and offered help. Others sent warnings, threats, people who didn't like the idea of women having a place to escape to. But Clara and Colt held firm. They'd fought too hard to back down now. By the time summer arrived, the ranch was thriving. They had 30 horses, 24 people, and enough work to keep everyone busy. Clara had become something she never expected, a leader. People came to her with problems, with questions, with ideas, and she had answers. Not always the right answers, but answers nonetheless. One afternoon, Clara was in the barn when she heard a commotion outside. She walked out and saw a group of riders approaching, 5 men, all armed. Her heart jumped into her throat, and she called for Colt. He came running, rifle in hand, and they stood together as the riders pulled up. The man in the lead climbed down from his horse. He was older, with a badge pinned to his chest. A marshal. You Colt Mercer? The marshal asked. I am. I'm Marshal Hayes. I'm here about Silas Crow. Clara's stomach dropped. What about him? Hayes looked at her. You Clara Whitmore? Yes? Then you'll want to hear this too. Hayes pulled a piece of paper from his coat. Crow was arrested 3 months ago in Nevada. He's being held on charges of fraud, extortion, and human trafficking. The trial's in 2 weeks, and the prosecutor wants you both to testify. Clara stared at him. He's in custody? Yes, ma'am. Has been for a while. We've been tracking him since he left Arizona. He made the mistake of trying the same schemes in Nevada that he did here, except the law in Nevada doesn't play around. Clara felt like the ground had shifted under her feet. Crow was in custody. He was going to trial. He was going to pay for what he'd done. Will you testify? Hayes asked. Clara looked at Colt and he nodded. She turned back to the marshal. Yes, she said. We'll testify. 2 weeks later, Clara and Colt rode into Carson City, Nevada. The courthouse was bigger than anything in Red Mesa, and the streets were crowded with people. Clara felt out of place in her simple dress, but she held her head high. She wasn't the scared girl Crow had dragged through the dirt anymore. She was Clara Whitmore, and she had a story to tell. The trial lasted 3 days. Clara took the stand on the second day and told the jury everything. How Crow had tried to sell her, how he'd hunted her, how he'd terrorized an entire town. She didn't cry, she didn't falter, she just told the truth. Colt testified after her, backing up her story and adding details about the attack on the ranch. The prosecutor presented documents, witness statements, evidence of Crow's crimes going back years. By the time the trial ended, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Crow was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Clara watched as they led him away in chains, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but closure. It was finally over. Not just for her, but for everyone Crow had hurt. They rode back to the ranch a week later, and when they crested the hill and saw the valley spread out below, Clara felt something she'd been searching for her entire life. Home. Not a place she'd been forced to stay, not a place she was running from. Home. She'd learned something in the past year, something that had taken her too long to understand. Strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. It was about getting knocked down and getting back up. It was about letting people help you and helping them in return. The frontier was a hard place. It broke people, chewed them up, and spit them out. But it also forged them. It took the weak parts and burned them away, leaving behind something stronger, something that couldn't be broken. Clara had been forged. So had Colt. And together, they'd built something that couldn't be taken away. A year later, Clara stood on the porch of the house she'd helped rebuild, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other shading her eyes as she watched Colt work with the horses in the corral. The ranch had doubled in size since the trial. They had 50 horses now, a dozen permanent workers, and a steady stream of people coming and going, some staying, some moving on to build their own lives somewhere else. Anna was still there, running the kitchen and teaching the younger women how to cook. Thomas had married one of the women who'd come to the ranch looking for work, and they were building a house on the far side of the valley. Margaret from Red Mesa visited once a month, bringing supplies and news from town. The bartender had taken over Crow's old property and turned it into something decent. Clara felt the baby kick, and she smiled. She'd been terrified when she'd realized she was pregnant, terrified that she'd be a terrible mother, that she wouldn't know how to protect this child from the world. But Colt had held her hand and told her what she'd told so many women who'd come to the ranch. "You're stronger than you think." And he was right. Colt looked up and saw her watching. He smiled, that real smile she'd worked so hard to earn, and walked over. He climbed the steps and kissed her forehead. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired, but good." "You should rest." "I've been resting all morning." Colt put his hand on her belly, and the baby kicked again. His smile widened. "Strong, like his mother. Could be a girl." "Then strong like her mother, Chatir." Clara laughed and leaned into him. They stood there on the porch, looking out at the valley, at the life they'd built from nothing. The woman Silas Crow had tried to sell was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd learned that survival wasn't enough. You had to live. You had to fight. You had to build. The frontier hadn't broken Clara Whitmore. It had made her. And as the sun set over the Arizona hills, painting the sky in colors too beautiful to name, Clara realized something that made her chest feel full. She'd spent her whole life waiting for someone to save her. But in the end, she'd saved herself. And in doing so, she'd saved others. She'd become the person she'd needed when she was at her lowest. That was the real victory. Not defeating Crow, not winning the trial, but becoming someone who could stand on her own 2 feet and extend a hand to pull others up. Colt squeezed her hand and Clara squeezed back. They'd been through hell together, and they'd come out the other side. Not unscathed. They both carried scars, physical and otherwise, but they'd come out alive. They'd come out stronger, and that was all that mattered. The ranch would keep growing. More people would come. More challenges would arise. But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She'd learned that fear was just a feeling, not a fact. And feelings could be overcome. She thought about the girl she'd been in Red Mesa, kneeling in the dirt with a rope around her wrists, certain her life was over. If she could go back and tell that girl one thing, it would be this: hold on, it gets better, you get stronger, and one day you'll stand on a porch looking out at a valley you helped build, carrying a child you thought you'd never have, beside a man you didn't know you needed. And you'll realize that the worst day of your life was actually the first day of your real life. The day you stopped being property and became a person. The day you stopped surviving and started living. The day you became free.